Rogue and Shaman are definitely getting some very impactful cards that are going to be leaving in the upcoming standard rotation. So again, that is Year of the Griffin leaving standard. It's going to be Forged in the Barrens, United in Stormwind, and Fractured in Alterac Valley. So let's talk about Rogue and Shaman cards here that are going to be leaving. And of course, we have to start with the quest lines and hero cards here. So for Rogue, the Rogue quest line hasn't really been used for a little while, but it definitely was used for a good chunk of time. And that is the Find the Imposter quest line here for playing SI cards. So you would get these gizmos in your hand, and then at the very end, you'd end up getting this Spymaster Scabs to be able to get additional value. You'd get additional cards. You could shadow step that and do it all over again. And each of the SI cards on their own also created some additional value, gave the rogue potentially removal options, extra damage, stealth minions. There was a lot that kind of went into this SI and quest style package. The hero card now, Scabs, incredibly impactful card here. Shadow Crafter Scabs, returning all the minions to hand, summoning 2/4/2 minions with stealth for the rogue player, and then giving that hero power that made your next card cost 2. Just tons of value for the rogue, and even just on its own, that effect of putting all minions back into the owner's hand really helped the rogue a lot with quite a variety of decks over the last 2 years. Rogue has been able to kind of stall the game a little bit because of that against some more aggressive wideboard style decks, or even try to close games out with those stealth minions, plus maybe a little bit of over-the-top damage. And just that hero power, as many of the hero cards kind of are, that hero power adding just a little bit more flexibility as well. But Scabs definitely seen in quite a few of the rogue archetypes over the last 2 years. Very, very impactful hero card. And with that questline and the SI cards, I just want to mention the kind of couple of really big SI cards for Rogue. That is SI Operative, SI Informant, and that SI Assassin. Those were all really used in that kind of quest deck, that SI package. Now, there are a handful of cards that I really think were pretty impactful across several rogue archetypes over the last few years. So we're going to talk about a few of these here. Wicked Stab, the Ranked Spell, and Shroud of Concealment, both used in multiple varieties of rogue decks. I mean, Wicked Stab, an incredible damage, potentially sometimes game ending for the rogue, was used again in a ton of archetypes in that like pirate rogue with Mr. Smite and a lot of burst damage, used in kind of the miracle style decks as a cheap damage spell. Huge couple of cards there. And as well, the Shroud of Concealment was used in multiple archetypes, multiple varieties of rogue decks to draw really key minions that the different decks needed. Huge loss there, especially for Rogue, losing some of that draw mechanic that's really kind of pivotal for a lot of those Rogue decks. And then the next two cards here that, again, used in quite a few of the Rogue decks, Blackwater Cutlass and the SI7 Extortion. Now, this one was also used in that like questline SI deck that I mentioned earlier, but since I'm bringing it up here because it was used in so many more decks than just that one, I didn't want to include it with that SI package, because the SI Extortion, being able to deal 3 damage to either your opponent's face kind of early in the game, or just 3 health minions that hadn't been damaged, or even 4 health minions a lot of time, to be able to deal 3 to something that wasn't damaged and then kill it off with that rogue hero power, is something that has been really impactful, I would say, for Rogue, in being able to answer some of those opponent minions, at least before we got things like the concoctions that were dealing 3 damage. SI Extortion was huge for answering opponent minions. And it had that very important tradable effect, as well as the Blackwater Cutlass. So having the tradable as well, really, really huge for Rogue, to being able to cycle through the deck, find other key cards, and really played a part in many different archetypes. Now, one of those archetypes that really, really capitalized on that tradable effect and drawing minions with that Shroud of Concealment I talked about was the Garrote Rogue. And yeah, the Garrote card itself leaving, along with, I would say, 2 of the most impactful minions in that Garrote style deck, which was Efficient Octobot and Field Contact. These 2 minions getting drawn from Shroud of Concealment, and then being able to use tradable effects, play Battlecry and combo cards to draw through, and get to that kind of fatigue end style game with those Garrotes. Incredibly, incredibly powerful combination of cards. Tons of different archetypes for Rogue have been seen the last couple of years, and one of those really, really came about because of the card Maestra of the Masquerade. Now, this in combination with the Wildpaw Knoll and even things like Double Agent really made this hidden, masquerading style rogue very prevalent for quite a while in the meta. Many people thought that Maestra kind of seemed like a meme style deck or archetype, but it definitely proved to be very, very powerful over time, especially because of the Wildpaw Knoll, which did end up getting nerfed at least once, if not a couple of times. And of course, we have to mention the huge poison weapon rogue that was a thing for a while as well, with Swine Tusk Shank, Paralytic Poison, and Silverleaf Poison, most notably, again in combination with a couple of those other minions and draw mechanics and some damage, but building up a large weapon that was poisonous or immune or drawing cards when your hero attacked was very, very impactful and quite a nasty deck to have to deal with for a little while in Standard. 2 more still rogue archetypes that have been seen in Standard that were pretty popular are Death Rattle Rogue and what people have called Thief Rogue or Jackpot Rogue. Jackpot not leaving. Jackpot is actually still going to be in Standard, but a few of the cards that really helped make that deck repetitive and gain a lot of value over the long run are leaving. So let's talk about those. Most notably, Contraband Stash, as well as Reconnaissance. Now, Reconnaissance is kind of an interesting one. It got tested, I think, in some versions of Death Rattle Rogue, because it gave you a Death Rattle minion, but it actually ended up being quite a bit better in this kind of thief jackpot style of play because it was giving you a minion from another class. And a lot of the Death Rattle minions, things like Mountain Bear or Mida from Priest, ended up being very incredibly good for Rogue to get copies of, especially with that extra discount on the mana. And then being able to replay those with this Contraband Stash. So I think Reconnaissance ended up being much more of a thief style, playing cards from other classes style of card rather than an actual Death Rattle kind of deck. But the Death Rattle cards that have been used in Death Rattle Rogue, some of those key cards are leaving. So things like this Forsaken Lieutenant, this Snowfall Graveyard, and Sketchy Information. Very, very huge cards, very key support cards for the Death Rattle decks to be able to get multiple Death Rattle triggers, or with that Sketchy Information, be able to actually draw specific things from the deck. I mentioned in one of the other videos how important very specific tutored type draw effects are, And that is exactly what sketchy information provided for Death Rattle Rogue. And the last card that I want to talk about for Rogue that was used kind of off and on in a little bit of variety of decks and also did see multiple changes is Edwin himself here. Edwin Defias Kingpin. Incredible card for Rogue, being able to have additional draw mechanics, but also get large stats out of it. And in some of the decks that Edwin was played in, a lot of the Rogue cards were very cheap to play, so it was often incredibly easy to get Edwin at least to an 8-8. There were even times where it was a 10-10, 12-12, and sometimes pretty early in the game, or Rogue players could Shadow Step Edwin, be able to replay that for incredible value. Now taking a look at Shaman cards, again going to start with the questline and the hero cards here. The questline Command the Element was a quest based on playing Overload cards, being able to complete that questline to get out BRUKAN and be able to essentially recast your spells. Your spells would cast twice if you'd played BRUKAN, so often ending games with burst damage and direct damage to the face that would cast twice. This saw some play very early on when quests first came out, and after some nerfs and some other cards came out, this questline did start falling out of favor. It really hadn't been played for quite a while now in Standard. Unlike some of the other quests that kind of have come and gone, this one had its time and then kind of faded away. However, the hero card, very much the opposite. The Shaman hero card, BRUKAN, incredibly powerful effects for a variety of decks in Standard, being able to pick 2 of 4 options and really customize it to what was happening in the game and create kind of just value in the long run for the Shaman of either putting the opponent on a clock with potentially dealing 6 damage with the hero powers, or being able to repetitively put out a couple of taunt minions. Quite a bit of value in many of the games for Shaman. Now, a few other cards that have been seen in quite a few Shaman decks over their time in Standard, the Wind Chill and Sleep Breaker, kind of both have seen a bit of play, and Wildpaw Cavern. These 3 have definitely been used even in some more aggressive decks, just for that extra draw or creating extra bodies with the Wildpaw Cavern, or in some of those slower Shaman decks, again, just creating that value, the ability to draw through the deck, find some of those other removals or other strong minions. It didn't seem to matter. Wildpaw Cavern getting a nerf at one point. Just a lot of value from these cards for Shaman over the last 2 years. And then, of course, we have to talk about Bolner Hammerbeak, Brilliant Macaw, and, of course, the Snowfall Guardian. Now, Snowfall Guardian did get a huge nerf. The body actually changed to just freezing minions. Before the change, it actually would freeze minions and get additional stats based on how many minions were frozen. So people were doing huge combinations with this Bolner, the Macaw, the Guardian, to be able to get repetitive effects and put out massive stats that weren't really able to be dealt with because everything else on the board was frozen. So huge impact in the meta that definitely had to be addressed with a kind of drastic nerf, changing completely how that Snowfall Guardian worked. And even after the Guardian nerf, Bolner Hammerbeak and the Macaw have been used in other ways and other decks to get more impact. Hammerbeak being used specifically with some of the Murlocs to get repetitive draw or discounts, just extra effects. The Macaw being used to copy that BRUKAN hero card battle cry effect as well. So a lot of implications over the time in Standard with these ones. Then a few really great support cards that came out that were used in that questline Shaman or even in other decks have been Perpetual Flame, and again, especially in that quest deck was Overdraft. That tradable mechanic, unlocking overload crystals, but also dealing damage, really made some of that end game, your spells casting twice, or just using that overload mechanic and actually using it for a benefit. These cards were huge for quite a while with that questline deck. And even after the questline changes and more cards got added, Overdraft and a lot of those overload cards themselves did kind of fall out of favor, but the Perpetual Flame was used for a while longer just because of how good of a board removal tool it was against more aggressive and wide board decks. And speaking of wide board aggressive decks, we definitely do have to talk about some of this elemental package. Now, Elemental Shaman hasn't really been as prevalent in the last year because last year's rotation did impact that Elemental Shaman, that more aggressive elemental deck, by some of the cards that it really leaned on rotating out last year. But definitely wanted to highlight some of these things like the Canal Slogger, Granite Forgeborn, were definitely huge in that deck, and Canal Slogger had even been put into other decks at some points for that overload mechanic, but just the immediate board impact and the lifesteal itself was also very huge. And then a couple more of those elementals, the Wailing Vapor, the Arid Stormer, and the Lily Pad Lurker, all were very, very prevalent in those earlier days, when there was even more support for Elemental Shaman, but having those early game minions to really be able to put a lot of pressure or answer opponent minions. And then I did mention not only the Elemental Shaman, but that Questline Shaman, and I mentioned a little bit of the Murloc stuff. So these last two cards were kind of support in some of those as well. The Firemancer Flurgle and the Primal Dungeoneer. Now, both of these were used really as support in varying decks. The Flurgle used in Murloc Shaman, but also used in more of that like Murloc Control Shaman list that was going around for a while that only had 3 or 4 Murlocs, really, but it was still used to help clear opponent boards. And that Dungeoneer used a lot in that Elemental Shaman, but also in a couple other decks as well, just for some targeted draw, because Shaman, all at the same time, it did lose some of that draw, so the Dungeoneer really kind of filled a bit of that gap as well. Well, definitely seems like Rogue is losing quite a bit of stuff, and it's going to be interesting to see what happens. But what do you think of these two classes and the cards that are leaving? What kind of archetypes do you think are going to maybe come around after these? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for checking this out. And if you haven't already, go ahead and check out the latest video as well, talking about the Paladin and Priest cards. Priest losing so much. It's basically getting gutted, it feels like. So if you haven't checked that out already, and I'll see you in the next one.